like now to introduce to you our speakers, Simon Wayne Hobson and David Neve. Simon Wayne Hobson is a well-known scientist at the Institut Pasteur in Paris, and his main area of expertise is the HIV virus. But that's not the reason why we invited him tonight. He's outside the Institut Pasteur. His main area of expertise are Georgian glasses. And that is how he came across the glass that he will talk about tonight. And it is thanks to David Neve, the historian, that Simon Wayne Hobson learned about the Königsberg Kant glass. David Neve is a historian, and his area of expertise is the history of Hull. And he will give us the historical background to the glass, while Simon Wayne Hobson will now introduce us to the topic. Simon, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you to all of you from the Friends of Kant and Königsberg for this chance to talk. It's lovely to do these cross-society meetings. Yes, the Glass Society is actually is the fusion of two older societies, one of which goes back, I think it's to 1936, where members used to meet in the homes of collectors in black tie. And so very formal. And of course, as you can see, times have changed. And yes, we are particularly interested, I'm particularly interested in Georgian glass, but the Glass Society has members that to go back and are experts in Roman glass, and it goes right through to contemporary glass and student glass, studio glass. It covers everything, and we have a little magazine which is put together about 3-4 issues per month. And when I get it, I basically sit down, I don't speak to my wife, and I read it from cover to cover, and then I get up and say, hello, dear. It's a lovely little publication. Now, David and myself are as a collector, and I came across a glass with an odd engraving and had a crest, and so I started looking into this, and I discovered it came from a hall and a family in South Yorkshire of about 1720, 1725, and I wrote to the Historical Society of Yorkshire, and lo and behold, I came in touch with David, who is a mine of information, very generous and very constructive. And after lots of ping-ponging by email, he said to me, did I know the Kant glass? And of course, I did not. So you see, we have, it's all David's fault, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And so I started looking at this glass and reading up about it, and the type of, and the inscription, and the David and myself, it was a lovely collaboration, and we put together what we hope is going to be an interesting story. If I can go to a screen save, Hannes, okay, I'm going to take the screen. Okay. Can you give me the screen?
You should be able to share the screen.
Okay, I've got it, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is basically the glass on the left, okay? It is about 22 centimeters high.
We don't see anything yet. Did you share your screen? Did you click on?
My apologies. I thought I had it.
On the bottom.
Share, I got it. My apologies.
Yeah,
is that it?
good enough.
Thank you. So this is the glass. It's about 22 centimeters high, and it is typical of the period of 1760 in England, glasses of this period. Now, I'll explain the structure of the stem, which is rather beautiful, but it, of course, is the diamond point inscription, where you can see on the top, Immanuel Kant, M.A. I've blown it up here, and it's a diamond point inscription, and there are a number of names. And on the right of the slide, I can take the whole screen. I'll do full screen mode. Here we go. So you have, the names are Immanuel Kant, Anthony Shawn, Robert Motherby, John Green, and down at the bottom, Joseph P. We do not, it's not possible to decipher the name, John Chappell and Charles Staniforth. The inscription says secrecy in love and sincerity in friendship. And then, of course, all happy together, notwithstanding what happened in the world. This is a rather obtuse remark, and I'll provide some conjectures as to what this could mean. It's precisely dated, and it's marked August of 30th, 1763, which is, we would not write it this way today, but perhaps of the time that was perfectly normal. I would like to point out on the next, wait a minute, on the next slide, no, here we are, that I've highlighted in red. Now these four names in red all have,
sorry, Simon, to interrupt, but the next page is not there. I still see only the glass.
Sorry, you have the glass, but I've highlighted the four names in red on the right. Can you see that?
No.
Yes?
At least I can't see it. Maybe it's me.
No,
I also can't see it. Maybe Simon, please stop your screen share and just start it again. Maybe there's a kind of delay.
Okay.
It actually also didn't switch to become like the full screen mode.
Okay, let me see if I can share again. Okay. Okay, do you have it now?
Yes, we have it now. Yeah.
Let's see. So that, can you see?
Yep.
Okay, I'll leave it like this. So, okay, here we go.
Go back.
Here we go. So I'll just pull this in. So here we are. So in red, I highlighted four names in red. We can call them the Hull Four. These gentlemen all have links to Hull. They're all merchants or seamen. So you see the strong English connection. Of course, Immanuel Kant, you people know more about Kant than myself and David combined, so I'll avoid talking about Kant, but we'll try and give you context. Anthony Shawn is, well, there is Anton Shawn who knew Motherby and knew Kant, and he lived in a town a few kilometers southwest of Königsberg of the time. He was a son of a merchant. So basically, we have a story of 5 merchants and a savant. Immanuel Kant surrounding himself by very pragmatic people, merchants and seamen. And David will develop the story of what I can call maybe the second European waterway. We're all transfixed by the cultural implications of the Mediterranean, but in the North Sea through to the Baltic, there was massive trade, and it's probably been overlooked, and David will now take up the screen and he will develop this, and then I will come back and tell you more about the glass, how it was made, and put it in the context of glasses of that time. So over to you, David.
Right, thank you. I'm going to just do my share screen, I hope. It'll come up somewhere. That's got you on it rather than my screen. I'll have to just go in. Wait a moment. Bring this up, I hope. Right, I'm trying to share my screen, which doesn't, it's coming up, I hope, in a moment.
Perfect.
We're getting there.
Very good.
I'll just get to the first picture. Right, okay. Right, as Simon has mentioned, 4 of the 7 names engraved on the glass were of men who came from the English port of Hull, or to give its correct name, Kingston upon Hull. 2, Joseph Green and Robert Motherby, were permanent residents of Königsberg and close friends of Kant and are well known. The other 2, Charles Staniforth, who had recently married Joseph Green's sister, and John Chappell, were only visitors, but had probably known Kant for some years. What were the origins of these 4 men? Why were they in Königsberg, and what happened to them? We hope we're going to explore that. Yep. Hull's great strengths as a port were its proximity to the Netherlands, Scandinavia and the Baltic, and part of this great North Sea trading area that Simon has just mentioned. And it had a vast accessible hinterland, well, vast by English standards, accessible by an extensive river system which fed into the Humber estuary. It provided contact with much of the heartland of England, which was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. By the rivers and an increasing network of canals, places as far away as Stoke-on-Trent and Birmingham could be reached by water from Hull. So it was a very wonderful place for goods to come in because they could be transported by river boats and canal boats over a very wide area. The fathers of 4 of our Hull 4, the fathers of 4 of the 4 men were newcomers to Hull in the 1720s, 3 of them coming from this hinterland. John Green, father of Joseph Green, the main figure in the Immanuel Kant story, was living at the village of Swinefleet, the Green Circle, when he married a Hull girl at the nearby small market town of Snaith. He was a mariner, was John Green, the father of Joseph, no doubt sailing one of the river boats transporting goods to and from Hull. It was in and around Snaith that the Motherby family came. Robert Motherby's father, George, was born nearby in the village of Hambleton. He came from a farming family. In the mid-1720s, John Green and George Motherby and their wives became members of the Baptist church at Bridlington, surprisingly some 50 miles away on the coast. The 2 men, John Green and George Motherby, clearly knew each other well and were probably related at this stage. Soon after they joined the Baptist church, they moved to Hull, where George Motherby played a part in founding the Baptist church. Charles Staniforth's family were also nonconformist, and they came from Sheffield. And they had moved into Hull again in the 1720s, had his father. And John Chappell, the 4th one, we don't know certainly where they came from, but they said to have been Huguenots, and the name Chapelle seems to be a Huguenot name, and they're said to have fled from France in 1685, escaping the persecution. 2 of the fathers of these are 4 men, John Green and Benjamin Chappell, already by the 1730s were travelling between Hull and Königsberg. They were part of this great Baltic trade that was mentioned. The Hull had been trading with Scandinavia and the Baltic since its foundation, since the 14th century. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the trade was largely controlled by the Hanseatic merchants, and in the late 16th to 17th century by the Dutch. The English Navigation Acts of the 1650s restricted trade between the Baltic and England to English ships and those from Scandinavia and the Baltic ports. This helped make the century from the 1660s a golden age for Hull merchants. The chief exports to the Baltic were West Riding cloth and Derbyshire lead. The chief imports were iron, timber, hemp, flax and yarn, some of the raw materials for the Industrial Revolution. Yarn, hemp and flax were the main exports from Königsberg. And as it note on the slide, at the end of the 18th century, 90% of East Prussian yarn went out of Königsberg and nearby ports to Hull. and from Hull it went over to Manchester and the Lancashire Mills. By the 1750s, Philip Green, the brother of Joseph, Charles Staniforth, their future brother-in-law, he had married Joseph Green's sister just before he was there for the meeting on August the 30th, 1763 in Königsberg. He'd married in the West Riding. And John Chapel as well were all sailing between Hull and Königsberg. So early in the 1750s, they were actively visiting Königsberg. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, greatly affected trade in the Baltic, especially as Russia and Prussia were at war, and Britain sided with Prussia. There was a report in July 1757 that Captain Philip Green had been taken by the Russian fleet, but as you can see there, he was let out after 24 hours. Joseph Green was probably in partnership with his brother Philip Green, and he was settled in Königsberg as an agent for the firm and probably for other Hull merchants by 1750. We don't know exactly when he got there, but probably about 1750. Not that long after, in the early 1750s, the young Robert Motherby, who was a relative, his father had died when he was young, was sent out or went out to Königsberg to act as assistant to Joseph Green. It wasn't unusual for Hull merchants to have a member of their family or somebody in a port in the Baltic and Scandinavia at this time. A family that had many people over the period 1630 to 1790 was the wealthiest of the Hull merchant families, the Maesters, who imported iron from Sweden and then Russia. And they had people resident at various times in all those Scandinavian and Baltic ports that are marked in red on the screen. Arthur Maester, who is in the portrait on the left, was resident in St. Petersburg from 1754. And he's shown, it said, wearing a Russian merchant's cloak. The men from Hull coming to Königsberg must have been impressed greatly by the city they were coming to. Although the two places had similar origins, both founded in the 13th century by a king, Königsberg by King Ottokar of Bohemia and the Teutonic Knights, Kingston upon Hull by King Edward I, both named after a king, King's Hill and Kingstown, they were quite different in status and cultural life in the 1760s. Königsberg was at least 4 times the size of Hull, was the capital of East Prussia and had a cathedral and university. Hull had no particular significance other than that of a flourishing port and regional marketing centre. Educational institutes were limited in Hull. There was a grammar school, but a few other minor schools, but very little of any high status. And it had only 2 parish churches. It was beginning to rival York as the main town in Yorkshire at this time. Its population was rising fast and trade was growing. But Hull was not backward, uncultured town, and the leading merchants were wealthy and had important national as well as local connections. These are some of the houses that still survive of the merchants in the High Street in Hull. High Street runs parallel to the River Hull, after which Hull takes its name, and the merchants had their houses backing onto their wharves on the river. These are some of the grander houses that fortunately have survived. The grandest on the far left, the Maester House of this merchant family I've already mentioned. Henry Maester, the builder of it in the 1740s, was a member of Parliament, and amongst his friends was the architect and great patron of the arts, Lord Burlington, who advised on the staircase alongside William Kent. William Kent, the great architect and landscape gardener, the family name, in fact, was Kant, but spelt with a C. All the merchants suddenly wanted grand staircases and they were adding them to their houses or building houses with them, even though most of these new grand staircases looked out on blank walls or adjoining warehouses. Blade's house, the second one along, was a home of a family of merchants and shipbuilders. The Bounty of Mutiny fame, the ship The Bounty of Mutiny fame, was built by the Blades in an adjoining shipyard to this house. The third house along, Wilfor's house, of course, is earlier in appearance. It's Dutch style. and it was the birthplace of William Wilberforce. Wilberforce gives us a little picture of what Hull was like in his youth in the 1760s and 70s. He says, Hull was then one of the gayest places out of London. The theatre, balls, large supper and card parties were the delight of the principal merchants and their families. Well, our Hull Four were not from this merchant aristocracy. They came from humbler beginnings in the same similar way that Immanuel Kant did, from seamen who become sea captains and some with agricultural background. But you can see with the house on the right, which was the home of Philip Green, Joseph's brother, in the late 1760s, early 1770s, that they were rising up. This also had a grand staircase from which Philip Green could look into the garden of William Wilberforce next door. He had become a ship owner more than a sailor. He'd given up being a ship captain, it seems, and was a ship owner and merchant. Ship owners, as distinct from merchants, were a new breed beginning to dominate English ports from the late 18th century. The quote at the top of the screen, the ships that crowded the harbour at Königsberg were loaded with yarn, worth 5 times as much as tobacco, 4 times as much as sugar, and 3 times as much as pepper. It was a very worthwhile commodity to export. Those goods that were coming into the Bristol and Liverpool were making their merchants very rich indeed, richer than Hull merchants, but clearly yarn was what was making both the Königsberg trading house of Green and Motherby, who specialised in exporting hemp, flax and yarn, of course the trading house which Immanuel Kant invested in, and a trading house which managed his finances. And yarn made the fortunes of the other members of the Joseph Green's family and Staniforth's family. Joseph Green brother Philip, brother-in-law Charles and brother John Staniforth all made their fortunes in yarn. Philip Green and John Staniforth, brother of Charles, also invested the increasingly lucrative whaling industry, which Hull became the leading whaling port in England in the 1820s, not something we're necessarily as proud of now, but it was very successful. And one of the ships that went out of Hull whaling was called the Königsberg. I'm sure it must have been owned by Philip Green or John Staniforth. That painting shows two views of it from different angles. Up until they also invested in the new dock, and on the left-hand side, the map shows the new dock that came in 1778. Up to 1778, Hull was surrounded by brick walls and the 17th century defences. They began to be taken down as new docks were built around it, and the first was this great new dock of 1778. The first ships to enter it were owned by John Staniforth and Philip Green. There were 20,000 people watching them come in. Philip Green's ship was illuminated at night by a great paper lantern and by 1,200 lights. When the dock came, Hull expanded to the north and west, and the new area to the north was the fashionable area, the northern suburb, and Philip Green and John Staniforth both built houses there opposite each other on Charlotte Street, which is now known as George Street. The house on the far left, the two-storey one, was Philip Green's house. That's where he lived. Well, all these things were happening in Hull, and Hull was expanding, the trade was expanding, the merchants, both in Hull and in Königsberg, were reaping the rewards of the Industrial Revolution and the transport of the yarn. This information, of course, would be what was happening in Hull, would have kept Joseph Green and Motherby and Kant all well informed of the developments. They still had these family connections. Robert Motherby's unmarried sister still lived there, as did a nephew, a mariner son of his brother George, the doctor, the author of the New Medical Dictionary and the pioneer of smallpox vaccination at Königsberg. His nephew still lived in Hull, and George himself was buried in 1793, the place where we live, the nearby town of Beverley. Charles Staniforth, by then a successful London merchant, died at Philip Green's house in Hull. In his will, made in 1783, he left Joseph Green £100 at Königsberg, and also my friend Robert Motherby £100. Joseph Green, in turn, in his will, left Charles Staniforth's daughter and possibly other children £500, a very substantial sum. Staniforth's son, show where they were rising to, became MP for Hull in 1802, a director of the Bank of England, and not long afterwards bankrupt. Finally, just what of John Chappell, the youngest of the Hull Four, in August 1763? He was said to have been a courteous and gentle-natured man, slight, gracious and cultivated. He so loved books and poetry that he never put out to sea without his much-read copy of Milton's Paradise Lost. He remained a sea captain for the rest of his life, but in March 1775, on leaving Königsberg, his ship, the John and Mary, was totally lost in a storm. Chappell survived, but he died the following year, aged 36. He left a wife and a young daughter, Anne. The daughter, Anne, much later married Matthew Flinders, the celebrated navigator who first charted much of the Australian coast. Like Immanuel Kant in Kaliningrad, John Chappell's son-in-law Matthew Flinders has a university named after him in Adelaide, South Australia. But I must stop now and hand back to Simon and more talk about the glass. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Simon, we can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
I was on unmute. I've unmuted it. Hannah, I'm going to take the screen, okay?
Yes.
There we go. So here we have the, I'm going to have to get rid of this. Okay, so here we have the, I'll go on full screen mode, right. So I've decided to tell you a little bit about the glasses and how they're made, because it's always nice to learn something, and probably most people, other than members of the Glass Society, don't know much about how glasses are made and much about the history of glass. As you know, you have the wonderful Italian glasses, Façon de Venise from Venice and Altare, which is basically made up of sand and soda. Then the Bohemian big contribution was to make a harder glass, which was made of sand, potash, and a lime mix. This was very good because it allowed engravers to work on the hard glass. And the German, the Bohemian engravers were almost second to none. And then the big contribution from the English was the, if I may say, the invention of lead glass. Now, lead glasses have been known for many years, and they were made in small quantities. And I think it was the development of lead glass in English and the extent to which the glass makers ran riot with this lovely, easier material, which was, because of the lead, had a much greater refractive index and scattered light more. So it was much more beautiful. And it was the closest thing to the grail of the time, which was rock crystal. Because rock crystal is pure quartz, silica oxide, without impurities. And the goal of glass makers has always been to make something as transparent as rock crystal. And so the gentleman called George Ravenscroft is accredited with developing lead glass, although in fact it's a couple of gentlemen in his glass house who are probably the geniuses behind it. So from 1674 through to about 1780, we call it the golden age in some ways of Georgian glass. I use the word toxic, which may be unusual. I'm using it in an artistic sense, like feverish, creative. They made this beautiful product, and then it was so beautiful that they just ran riot. They couldn't stop inventing new forms, and as you will see, on the next slide the sorts of beautiful glasses that they made. They are called baluster. The early period is called baluster glasses, and I've shown one on the left here. It's a baluster heavy, we call it a heavy baluster glass, about 1700. It's 22 centimeters high, and it's a hefty 609
Simon, sorry to interrupt you again, but I guess we can't see the right slide. I have the second out of 7 pages.
This is the same problem we had.
Seems like there's a now I can see another slide.
Okay, I will leave it here. Thank you, Hannes.
Good.
So my apologies. I was talking about this glass on the left, which we call a baluster glass. Now, the word baluster comes from this architectural motif. Of course, the baluster, which was used for railings. The origin of the word is Latin and ultimately Greek, and it's the translation is basically to resemble the flower of a pomegranate. This is the baluster. And of course, as humans start messing around and playing, they not only develop beautiful objects like this baluster, but then variations on a theme. And in this case, in the glass field, we will call it an inverted glass baluster, because this baluster is the other way out. And this is a typical glass of the time. And so glass makers ran riot in making a large number of glasses of this form. And very quickly, as you'll see, changes started, because with this beautiful medium, the human imagination just couldn't, glass makers couldn't stop using and dreaming up new ideas. And as you'll see on the second one here in the middle, this is called a Newcastle light baluster. It's much lighter in form. The pure baluster form that we see here is now changed. And this particular one is wonderfully engraved. When you have this beautiful grading, it'll invariably be Dutch, German perhaps, but mainly Dutch. And you'll see many of the coats of arms of these 7 Dutch provinces and coats of arms of William of Orange, of the Nassau family. And of course, from Newcastle to Holland was another example of North Sea trade, as David so nicely showed the passage of the merchant fleets between England, Holland, through to Scandinavia, and to ultimately to St. Petersburg. And you see a radical change in a very few years. And of course, it didn't stop there. In 10 years later, this was the dominant form. There's something called an air twist. You'll see these lines in there. These are fine tubes of air drawn within the stem of the glass. And this was a wonderful period around 1755, 1765. Some of the most beautiful English glasses of the 18th century come from this period, and they scatter the light wonderfully. And you've got to remember, when people are having supper, it's all by candlelight. So making the most of the little bit of light of candles around was magic. And these glasses refracted light wonderfully. And also these look beautiful under a very nice candlelight. But that wasn't enough. In a matter of, say, 10 more years, the dominant mode was this form called an opaque twist. I call it an ale glass because this glass has gilding with hops and barley. Hops in German is Hopfen. And in fact, all these 3 glasses have barley and hops on it. These are, we would call them ale glasses, but of course, if you did not have engraving or gilding, these would be wine glasses, certainly. Now, the interesting thing and the major feature of all these glasses of this period is the change in the stem. The heavy baluster, the light baluster, the air twist, and now the opaque twist. Now, what are these things? I'll give you a close-up later on. But basically, inside the stem, you have these fine threads of opaque glass. So how do you make opaque glass? Well, it's very simple. You could add some salts of metals like tin or antimony, and when fused with the glass, they become opaque white. If it had been cobalt, these would have been blue. If it had been green, this could have been one of the salts of copper, and so on. There are yellow, purple, red, green, and I'll show you some later. The whole century of toxic art history is finished with what we call the facet stem period. Now, the quality of the glasses was getting much better, very, very clear. And these are cut first by hand and then with steam-powered and water-powered wheels, because around this period, the Industrial Revolution in England was getting going and power was available. And these things with these faces refracted wonderfully candlelight, and this basically took over the field and crowded out these very beautiful opaque twists. I'm going to concentrate on the opaque twist because the Kant glass belongs to this period, 1760, 1765. I'll show you on the next slide a variety of the stems. What you're seeing here on the top part is just a close-up of all the stems. And you see this ebulliency of human artistic creativity. They just can't stop, just making variations on a theme, some just more beautiful than the others. Basically, clear glass with a number of threads of opaque white glass, and again, the opaque white would come from tin or antimony salts. And you can see these. The period of where we see these is between 1755 and 1775, and the Kant glass fits perfectly this period because it's 1763. These are opaque white, but I mentioned earlier that you have these twists which are mixtures of white and red. This looks wonderful, but it's very simple. It's just mixing metal oxides to the glass, and you can have red, you can have peppermint blue, and you can have cobalt blue. And this is a cobalt blue, we call it ale glass, because you might be able to perceive a hop here. I talk about an artistic riot. There's just this exuberance of human beings once they've discovered a new way to do things. You open a door and you find more doors to be opened, and there are hundreds of variations on these things, and they are very beautiful to behold. If I move to the next slide, this is the Kant glass. This is a close-up of the stem. Now, well, if I just go back to the very first slide, I'll just do this for you. You see, here is the bowl. This is the glass. It's been broken here and been put together with a solder. And this is a gold braid that has been tied around the bottom. We'll come to why it's broken later. Let's look at the sea and try and learn how these stems are made. The Kant glass is a rare form of an opaque twist stem. Inasmuch we call it, we have our little jargon, every field has its jargon, and we would call this a triple series, opaque stem. Why triple? If you look carefully in this arrow, you will find a solid core in the very middle. And on here, I've tried to represent a cut, a cross-section through the stem, and you would have a solid white core. This, I've had to do gray, but this will be clear glass. Surrounding it here, you'll see what we call a gauze. And this will be basically made up of maybe 15 to 20 finer canes, which will be spaced around the inner core. Finally, on the outside, you'll have two outer canes or threads, as you wish, which are represented here. They're thicker compared to these gauze, and it's roughly to scale. So now this would be made on in a series of working of glass. You'd pick up the opaque, and then you cover it with clear glass, and you'd pick up more, and you'd make layers until you have a final structure with this cross section. Everything would be straight. the size of this would be something like the bottle part of a bottle of port. Okay, imagine in your mind, not the neck of a port bottle, but the bottle itself. So you would have something of maybe 10 to 12 centimeters in diameter and maybe 15 to 20 in height. But because it's lead glass, it has a very high density, and this you would have something about 5 to 6 kilos at the end of a metal and iron rod of maybe over a meter. And this, of course, has to be kept warm and hot, because as the glass cools, they have to go back to the furnace to heat it up until it's finally made. Then the twist, because the twist is very obvious when you see these glasses. Look, the twist is very apparent, but the twist is the very last thing that is made. Visually, the twist dominates, but it's the hard work is making up this accretion of layers into this structure. Once you've got this bottle of port, if I may call it this, it'll be fixed to 2 metal flanges here and be held by 2 children or young men or adults, and they would then start walking backwards and twisting it in their hands. Now, a glass bottle of port, you can do a simple calculation to get this stem as thin as this. They will have to be pulling this hot material out to about 7, 8, 9 meters long. And all the time they're pulling, they're twisting. And this looks a very gentlemanly exercise. It is not. Basically, they have to, in each of these people have to introduce 1 twist per second, and they have to produce about 1,000 twists together in this and pulling back at the same time. And it is remarkable, this handmade process of hot glass ends up with these very beautiful, very precise twists. The beauty comes from the layout, the different layouts, which are basically infinite, and the final piece is the twisting. Once it's drawn, and this is a 19th century design cartoon of what happened, this glass would be lowered onto a wooden ladder, if you wish, and allowed to cool. So this is the making of the stem. We still haven't yet made the glass. So what will happen now is that this 7 or 8 meters of twisted glass will now be cut up with a little a metal saw and then snapped, and you would basically pull off stem fragments of maybe 7 to 10 centimeters, depending on what you're interested in. We move to the next slide. Now we're going to build up the glass. The previous slide showed that this stem is assembled independently of the glass, and it's a separate process. And once you've drawn it out, you can probably have up to 200 stem fragments of roughly 7 centimeters. And then you can get going. So we're going to make the glass. The gentleman it's a group of people of the time, and the boss would be called the gaffer. So the first thing to be done would be a crude bowl would be blown using a blow iron. And as you will probably know, blowing of glass goes back more than 2 millennia. So you'd have a crude bowl would be blown. It would not be blown in this form. It would be a crude bowl. Then you would have a 7 centimeter fragment, in the case of the Kant glass, would be added to the base of the stem. The blow iron would be coming in at the top. This would be added. And then finally, the foot would be added. This would be made by another member of the team, and they would apply it. And in so doing, there would be a metal iron coming from the bottom. So there will be a moment, a transitory moment, where you have the blow iron at the top, the stem, and the foot with a metal iron called a pontil iron at the bottom. Then with a pair of metal scissors, the top part will be cut off and the blow iron taken away, and then the bowl will be worked into the form that the glass blower wants. This could be tall, this could be, and this is what we call an ogive, it could be a bell bowl, and there was a whole array of bowl forms, as you can imagine. If there's a variety of feet, there'll be a huge variety, of stems, there's a large variety of bowls. And so this is the last feature. This is being worked at 600 degrees or more because this has to be malleable, because otherwise the rigidity, it starts to set and there's nothing. So the gaffer is going to and from the furnace to keep it warm and malleable. And this whole process that I've described represents maybe 2 minutes of work for an experienced team of 3 to 4 people. It looks exquisite, but it's very quickly done for experienced people. There's a final process. Because the glass is going into the furnace and coming out and cooling, there's a lot of stress that gets built up into the glass. And this is not good, and as the slightest tap can fragment the glass. And so there's a process called annealing. And basically annealing is controlled cooling, where the hot glass is slowly cooled on a regular basis. So at one end, it will go into the annealing iron at several hundred degrees, and at the other end, it will come out at room temperature. And this makes the glass much more robust to fracture, and hence the reason for doing this. The glass, as I mentioned, is broken. The stem is broken, and the 2 parts have been put together by some sort of tin solder. Now, as all glass collectors will know, bowls are broken, feet are chipped. You can see a glass that has a wooden foot because it's been repaired. But to have a broken stem, this is the thickest part of the glass. This is the toughest part of the glass. And if it's broken, it would seem to be deliberately so. There was a group of glasses called toasting glasses of the period where they made very, very fine stems. And the trick was to break the glass. You would toast to the queen or your parents or the mayor, and then you'd snap it in with your hands, your fingers, and then no one else could use it. This probably was deliberate and then was repaired for some reason. So there was some special occasion, and this cryptic explanation, which between David and myself and doing the research, we felt it's basically conjecture because no one was there. We have no hard data as to what these men were doing and why. So this is conjecture, and for a scientist who was always looking for experimental proof, this is unusual to be talking about conjecture. But the 1763 had seen the peace after the 7 Years' War, which had pitted the European powers. Churchill has called it the First World War. But basically, as usual, the European powers were at each other, and France was unusually aligned with Austria-Hungary, and England was aligned with the emerging state of Prussia. And of course, lots of warfare. And in the article I wrote, I mentioned how the English used glass to get engraved and celebrate certain events during the 7 Years' War. The successes, of course, the English would not dream of mentioning the defeats, but and I'm sure anyone would do the same. But after this, there was, of course, financial failure because war cost money. There was a period of speculation, and then I think things started to break up. It started in Amsterdam, I think, on the 27th of July, and then there was the banking crisis. And of course, as David pointed out, that 5 of the names on the glass are merchants and seamen, very pragmatic people who would be traders. And of course, with a financial crisis, with banks folding, traders folding, commerce drying up, they would be hurt probably or presumably by this. And the presumption is that maybe they had escaped severe loss. They'd probably taken some body blows, but they were together to the point that maybe they could say, all happy together, notwithstanding. And that is a conjecture, but it's sort of a pragmatic interpretation of what might have happened. Finally, the second name, Anthony Shun, is probably the corruption or anglicization of Anton Schorn, who was the son of a merchant from East Prussia. His father was a very wealthy merchant who had ships and obviously trading extensively with the UK, but he had ships that went as far as Bordeaux and brought wines to the Baltic. And the father, I think it was in 1765, his fortune collapsed suddenly to great surprise, and the son went bankrupt with it. So it would have been nice if the narrative would have been happily ever after, but one of the names on the glass copped it, but a few years later. So I tried to be very pragmatic and mention to the Kant Fellows aspects that you're probably not too, you don't come across too often, because it's always, I love learning something new. And so I try to offer up something that might appeal to you. And both David and I will be delighted to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you once again, Marion, for setting this up.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon Wayne Hobson and David Neve. That is fascinating. You dug out a history that we were not aware of, and that's a great contribution by both of you, not only to Kant experts, but to historians as a whole, and apparently also to glass collectors. Thank you also, Simon, for explaining to those who are not familiar with historical glasses and their production, for going a little bit more into detail in the production process. And thank you to the Glass Society members for bearing with us, although they know that already. I think there might be quite a number of questions here, but before we come to the questions, thank you again. It is very, very worthwhile to learn about this history. Thank you both, and I look forward to any comments or questions